that Eric Siegel has ever written. But how many remember reading the book or seeing the movie Love Story, first of all? Most of us in our generation have. Okay. So love means never having to say you're sorry. How many people agree? Good, good. I think it is one of the single most stupid sentences ever written in the English language. And Eric Siegel made a lot of money from the book, but he'll be remembered for writing that stupid sentence. So I don't know whether that compensates him, whether the money is compensation enough. It seems to me that love or any relationship that you cherish will sometimes require you to say, even to apologize when you don't think you've done anything wrong, as a way of keeping the relationship solid. And that's true with lots of interpersonal relationships, not just with love. And obviously, if the apologies always go in one direction and never in the other, that's not necessarily a healthy relationship. But I think a healthy relationship involves sometimes having to apologize even when you don't think you have to. And in terms of scale of justice, simply because the other person's feelings are more important to you than being right. Okay. Let's get to a couple of the texts now about apologies and atonement, Roman numeral 2. Rabbi Eliezer taught, repent one day before your death. Now, it seems to me that this indirectly affirms two important principles. One, as Maimonides said, even a person who was wicked all his life, but repents at the very end, is never considered wicked. As it is written in Ezekiel, the wicked person will no longer stumble in his wickedness on the day he does teshuva. So if you do teshuva, your sins, your wickedness is done away with, and you will be rewarded in the world to come. So my first question is this true? How do we know that? And of course, the answer is we can't, because we have no real knowledge of what happens after we die, what the world to come, if it exists, is like. So why is this in the Talmud? Why does Maimonides say this? Because it's aspirational. The goal of these statements are to persuade people, to encourage people to make teshuva as a way of helping the community and helping the individual go forward. But we don't know if it's true. In fact, should it be true? Should a person who lives an evil life and does harm to people all his life win forgiveness from the divine court simply by truly doing teshuva the day before he dies?
Professor, were you looking for conversation, or you just want us to listen at this point? It sounded like you asked a question.
However you want to do it. If you have questions or comments, I'm perfectly willing to have you chime in. Sure.
I just wanted to say it sounds terribly Christian. That on your deathbed, you let Jesus into your heart, and you get to go to heaven. I don't think I've ever heard this concept in the context of Judaism.
That thought has occurred to me, and we'll return to it later in the talk. But yes, it does have a Christian sound to it. And Maimonides, as we know, was not Christian, but he says that. The second important principle that is implied in what Rabbi Eliezer said is the Day of Atonement atones for sins against God, but not so atone the day before you die. So what obvious question might arise? And as the passage in the Talmud relates, so students say, how do you know what day you're going to die? And of course the answer is you don't, so repent every day. We are supposed to repent every day, to do teshuva every day, not just wait till Yom Kippur, but Yom Kippur is a way of reminding us to do it for all the times he didn't do it earlier. The second text is, the Day of Atonement atones for sins against God, but not for sins against man, unless the injured party has been appeased. Well, what does that mean? It seems to me the word appease is significant. Some personal wrongs can be undone. The hurt caused by a harsh comment in a private conversation, a forgotten promise which can be made good, that's a hurt which can be undone. You can set the books right. But many of the harms we do to each other cannot truly be set right. It's not like, well, I took $20 from your wallet, so here's the $20 back, please forgive me. A confidence betrayed, an act of faith that was spurned, can have long-range repercussions not only between the two people, but also in the community at large. And those wrongs, once done, cannot be truly undone. And so the idea of doing teshuva as by making up for and compensating the victim of the wrong is an aspiration which quite often is simply impossible under the circumstances. I'm sorry, I thought it disconnected that. Once the bottle is open, the genie cannot be returned. All right, questions about so far? Again, I invite questions throughout the conversation. Okay, so far then. To whom should...
Yeah. Professor Fishman, yeah. So I think that statement of the Rambam Bezer, you have to add the word even. It's not carte blanche permission. You can sin your whole life as long as you do tshuva on the last day. It's, of course, they would all agree that it's much better to do tshuva at the half point of your life, and the earlier the better. They would all agree on that. What they're saying is, even if you didn't do it until your last day, the gates are never locked. That's how I understand it. It's not a permission. They would, it's not, okay, I can sin my whole life. It's just that the doors are never locked until the very end.
Understood. But the idea that once you do teshuva, you are, again, to use the Christian language, you are cleansed of all of the previous sins, is not, but I would understand it, a Jewish concept. That seems to be what's being said there. Sure, the gates are never locked. I can agree with that. You gain something for doing teshuva even much later than you should, but how much should you gain? And again, the question is, we don't know. We know what we want to believe. We know what our sages tell us, but we don't know. We don't know because only somebody who's died and gone through the process could know, and we haven't figured out a way to open that line of communication yet. All right, to whom should we apologize and atone? Obviously, we atone to those whom we know we've hurt. And paragraph 2 about sending out a general email or Facebook apology. I want to apologize for anyone I have hurt or insulted or offended in any way this year. What are your thoughts about that? Has any of you ever sent such a generalized public apology? Have any of you ever received them?
I have not, because I know I would hate it if I received one of those. That's not sincere.
I mean, any other thoughts from anyone about whether or not that's something you should do or something that you appreciated somebody else doing? It seemed to me that if I were going to do that, I would add a sentence. If I have hurt you or offended you in any way, please tell me how so I can apologize and try to make good. That at least opens a dialogue rather than saying, okay, I've done this, next step. It shows a level of sincerity, perhaps, that the generalized, everybody forgive me so I can start the year fresh, does not. Now, if you have wronged someone in a serious way, you've done something which you definitely should not have, are there any circumstances under which you should not approach that person and apologize? Open-ended question. There's no right. I don't claim to have right or wrong answers to these questions. As a law professor, I'm much better at asking questions than answering them. That's how I made a living for the last 50 years.
I think, I don't want to take all the time, but to answer your question, I think that if you know that such an apology will hurt the other person, I think it's a bad idea just to make yourself feel better, knowing you're now doing another sin and hurting somebody worse.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Anyone else have any thoughts or comments?
If there's no conceivable way that you can fix what you did, why would you apologize? I mean, it just makes it worse to apologize.
It can. I mean, one of the things that we're told in the Talmud is, don't apologize while a person is still hot with anger. Let the situation cool down for a while first. You may not be willing to listen to an apology or an attempt to make amends while the hurt is still fresh and still troubling him very, very much, still in the forefront of his mind. But also, if the other person does not know that you have done the hurt, then apologizing informs him of that and upsets him terribly. A spouse who cheats on a spouse, I feel terribly guilty about it. I'm going to cleanse my conscience by telling my wife. If she didn't know about it, I mean, who am I helping? Probably neither one of us, certainly not her. So there's a certain degree of strategy going on, really, in deciding who to approach to apologize, or whether or when. I have not had that experience, by the way. I want to make it clear. My wife is sitting off stage left here with the club in case I cross the line. But the purpose to apologize is, yes, to make teshuva, to cleanse your soul, but it's also to try to cure or reduce the hurt that you've done. And if you can't do the latter, then you're stuck with the former. It seems to me that's what the psychologists whose works I've read. I don't claim to be an expert on the subject. That you apologize when you think it might do some good to the person to whom you are apologizing, even if by not apologizing you're worsening your own sense of self-worth. Keep your mouth shut until the appropriate time, if ever it comes. On the other hand, halakha says you should apologize, and so we sometimes have a conflict between what some of the psychologists say and what halakha says. Okay, questions? All right, then, how to word or not word an apology? What about, I'm sorry you were offended by what I said, or I'm sorry if anyone was offended by what I said? How do those shape up as valid apologies? What's wrong with them? What's less than ideal about them? Anyone? I mean, Stephen and I have a wonderful dialogue, but I'm sure he would be happy I would too, for the other people to join as well.
The speaker is expressing some sense of loss themselves, rather than focusing on the offended party. They're putting some of it on, I'm sorry. Well, I want to get rid of this guilt. I'm not really focused on you. I'm focused on myself.
Exactly. It shifts the blame. I'm sorry that you were so super sensitive that what I said offended you, even though it shouldn't have. That's the implication.
I think you need to add, how can I make it up to you?
Sure, that definitely has to be part of the apology. But the initial wording is important, because if the initial wording seems to shift the fault or even share the fault with the other person, he or she may not be willing to listen to the rest of what you, or may not be able to listen fully and fairly to the rest of what you have to say. Be very specific about what you are apologizing about. And even if you are convinced that the blame is 50-50, or even the blame is more on the other party, don't mention it.
I think that the other thing it says your perception. If it's your perception that basically I hurt you or injured you, when that's not the issue. It's not the other person's perception. It's your feeling that you've hurt someone. So you're right, it's shifting the blame to somebody else, or shifting the issue to somebody else.
And the other rule that all the experts agree is the word but, as I said in the handout, the word but should never appear. I'm sorry I did this, but you shouldn't have done that first. You've just destroyed any possibility of probably destroyed the possibility of the apology being accepted. Now, I mean, problems can arise. How could you have done that? The person says to you. I shouldn't have done it. I'm ashamed. I hope you'll forgive me. That might be, and if the person insists on an explanation 2 or 3 times, I don't know what to do. I haven't had that situation arise very often, but that's when it gets tricky, because they're not going to be satisfied. If a person's not going to be satisfied until you give an explanation, I overreacted. I completely overreacted to something you did, and I shouldn't have. I mean, again, that's a way of always keeping the focus on the wrong that you did to the extent that you can, even if the person insists on how could you or why did you after you've made the abject apology. And of course, always tell a person, look, our relationship is very important to me, and I want to make it up to you any way I can. Please tell me what I can do, and hopefully there'll be an answer. Maybe there won't be. The question that the psychologists that I've read disagree about: should you ask the other person to forgive you? Now, halakha indicates you should.
I think so.
And it might be counterintuitive not to, but what about that?
I think you should. If you want to make a real, heartfelt apology, asking the other person to accept it, I think lets you both know that you're concerned that they understood your point, that you are apologizing, and what else could I do to make it better is furthering that, I think.
Well, sure.
I think one should. I think
what about including, will you forgive me as part of the apology? Or something?
No, I don't think so. I think one should approach approach the wronged party and just say it all out and leave it at that. And it's up to the other party to consider whether he or she would forgive the offender or not. I don't think one should ask for forgiveness.
And what you're doing is setting up a quid pro quo.
Just because you're ready to apologize doesn't mean that the other person is yet able to accept that apology or is over the wrong that was done to him or her.
I think you've made the argument against very well. Somebody used the phrase quid pro quo. Now that I've said I'm sorry, I've done my part of it. Now you have to say you forgive me is the implication you might create. On the other hand, I have found in my life, especially when the other person is in a subordinate position in some sort of hierarchy, for example, I let a student down. I promised to review a document on times that he was about to submit, and I just didn't get around to it, and he had to submit it to somebody else without my review. It's easy to say I'm sorry. Well, it's not actually easy to say I'm sorry, but it's comparatively easy to say I'm sorry and not admit it. Or you lost your temper and you said something you shouldn't have to a staff member. I mean, not something absolutely terrible, but you were short-tempered with the staff member when he or she didn't merit that. And later on, you apologize. I have found that when I hope you will be able to forgive me. I've seen in the faces of the people I've said that to, like a whole different reaction, like, wow, he really means it. Because I thought I disconnected the phone, but for some reason I didn't. I pulled the plug from the wall. When I say that, I am making myself more vulnerable than merely when I say I'm sorry. Because I'm giving that person power over me to say no. And so I have found, again, in that kind of hierarchical relationship where bosses frequently don't even bother apologizing, let alone ask for forgiveness, it makes it a more real apology to the person you're apologizing to. At least that's my intuitive reading of situations where I've said that. So I Halakha says yes, many experts say no, and my conclusion, like any lawyer, well, it could be this or it could be that. But play it by ear and see how the situation seems to work out.
Professor, I have a question. When did the current definition of the word apology come about? Because I know 500 years ago, apology in Greek times meant you were giving a speech in your own defense. So how did we come from that to saying you're sorry for something you may or may not have done?
Well, I mean, I can tell you that halakha says that you must appease the other person, and that's in the Talmud, which goes back to about the 2nd century or the 3rd century of the Common Era. Right. So the idea of going to the other person and expressing remorse, seeking to make redress to the extent possible, and asking forgiveness has been part of Jewish law, virtually most of the last 2,000 years at the very least.
Okay, I guess I was thinking more of the English concept.
Yeah, I mean, the use of the Greek form of the word apology is that word has the definition of that word has morphed somewhat over the last several centuries in Greece, perhaps, or as it's been anglicized.
I think the saying sorry and then the other person forgiving are two independent variables, to use a mathematical analogy. So I think because giving him the power and making them dependent on each other can actually not be conducive. Because what if they say, no, I don't forgive you, and then they start going again about how wrong what you did to them, and that just makes things worse. So I think that if you say sorry, that's independent, and then maybe we can talk about does the other person have an obligation to forgive or not, but I would separate the two.
Yeah, valid point. As I say, in my experience, it seems to have worked. I never had that kind of flashback, but it's possible. I mean, when you apologize, you are making yourself vulnerable. When you ask for forgiveness, you are making yourself more vulnerable. And as Shammai says, you might be making the situation worse because you might be prompting to that person to say something to you, especially in a hierarchical relationship, say something to you, his superior in the hierarchy, that might make him fear afterward that he's going to suffer from the consequences further. It's a risk. It's a gamble. And in my experience, it's worked out, but it wouldn't always. You've got a valid point.
I think, Rabbi, it's also making yourself stronger, not just vulnerable. Because the bottom line for me is when I apologize, I'm apologizing for me. I don't care if the person forgives me or not. I mean, it's better if they do. But if they don't, I've done what I need to do, which is tell them I'm sorry for what happened, for what was done, for the misunderstanding, and I need to get it off my chest. And for me, that's the healing piece.
So this means that the act of apology is actually something that you do for yourself, that we're doing it for ourselves, but not really so much that we're thinking much about the offended party then.
Other thoughts or comments?
What I'd like to know about is how about, I'm sorry.
I began speaking, but my microphone was off.
Natalie.
Yeah,
Okay.
Natalie, please.
I was going to ask, what about a situation where someone commits lashon hara, and they apologize to the person, but it's out there in the world and it keeps happening, day after day, year after year. So what are you apologizing for the future? I mean, you've caused a harm that you cannot take back.
And that's part of the problem, obviously. Remember again that according to halakha, whether or not this is psychologically sound or not is something that I'm not sufficiently expert in the subject to comment on, other than to note that there's some disagreement. You must make every effort you can to appease that person. Obviously, there are circumstances like lashon hara, and we'll get to an example of that later on, where you cannot succeed. You cannot put the genie back in the bottle. It simply can't be done. Still, you are required to make every reasonable effort, and we'll get into what the details of every reasonable effort are in a moment or two, to appease that person. And the focus should be on trying to make that person feel somewhat better about the situation rather than to make yourself feel better. Obviously, making yourself feel better, if it works out that way, is a major fringe benefit. But the goal is to ameliorate the hurt to the extent possible that you have caused another person. And so that's what your focus should be on. That's why sometimes not apologizing at all, at least for a while, is the best thing, simply because you're convinced that any bringing up of the subject with that person will simply make him feel worse and make him fly off the handle. And that would be something that would exacerbate rather than ameliorate the situation. Other questions or comments?
Yeah, I have a question. In regarding the normal course of human interaction, this is a great conversation. I'm perceiving that this discussion tonight is in the context of Yom Kippur. And if that's the case, it opens another question in my mind about what I think I've learned in the past, which is when you say you're sorry and it isn't forgiven, and you say it a second and then a third time, if it's still not forgiven, the sin went to the person that you had tried to get an apology from. To give the apology to.
That brings us nicely to the next subject. When someone apologizes to you, how should you respond?
Right.
And halakha says you have the right to say no, and Maimonides says you particularly have the right to say no if you think the apology is insincere, and says you to establish the sincerity of apology only arises when the offender has another opportunity to commit the same sin and refrains from it. On the other hand, halakha also says that if you refuse 3 times to accept the apology, you have now become the offender, which is interesting because halakha also says that if you accept an apology with air quotes, but in your heart you really don't, it's still okay. You have fulfilled your obligation to accept. So I think what halakha is talking about here is not only trying to smooth over the relationship between the offender and the offended, but also to keep the community intact, so that at least the public appearance of giving and receiving an apology is itself a very definite, worthwhile thing, even if neither party really means it, and even if both parties know the other doesn't, because at least it prevents the community from dividing up in half and taking one side over the other. The social niceties have been done enough so that the community can proceed and kind of, if not ignore the situation completely, not dwell on the situation as a basis to divide the community further. And that's kind of surprising, because it says, even if you don't mean it in your heart, you have done what you are required to do. And that counts as accepting the apology. And so you have fulfilled your obligation to accept the apology, even if you didn't mean it, because you've helped keep the peace in the community, which is an interesting concept as well. We particularly given the tight-knit small communities in which the rules governing halakha are developed. But even today, where we live and act in so many different communities, within the work community or within the neighborhood association, or certainly within the synagogue, knowing that an ongoing feud exists between 2 people who are active can really be very damaging to the community. And so you hold your nose and you say, I accept your apology, even though you don't, is something that is an acceptable thing to do during halakha. Okay, so I've got some other texts. I assume you recognized who Rav Velvel Litleel Chanit, which means Shakespeare in Hebrew, the passage from the Merchant of Venice. But I always use that passage at the end of each semester before I handed out the student evaluation forms. When I started doing that, the student, what is Professor Fishman doing? He's going nuts. The students have had me for 2 or 3 classes, started to, anyway, it's always one of my favorite passages. What about paragraph 7, Eli Wiesel situation? If you haven't read it before, take a look at it now. Does everyone have a copy, or should I summarize it?
Under responding to an apology, that section, Professor?
It's paragraph 7 in the Sunflower. It's from. I'll just summarize it quickly.
Oh, there it is. There it is.
Wiesenthal is in one of the constant, I think Dachau, and he's plucked from one morning out of a work detail and brought by a nurse to the bedside of a dying Nazi soldier, who admits to Wiesenthal that during the invasion of Poland, he forced all the Jews in the community into a synagogue and then set fire to the synagogue. He's lying in bed. He's dying now. He realizes what he's done is terrible. He needs to know that a Jew has forgiven him. Will you please forgive me? What should Wiesenthal do? Should he say, yes, I forgive you, or should he not?
No.
He's only speaking for
No.
himself. He doesn't speak for the whole
No,
community.
he can't speak. You can't ask someone to forgive someone else. It's like saying, okay, my uncle said something very bad. I apologize. Please forgive him.
Okay, other thoughts or comments? What Wiesenthal did, many years later, he described the situation to numerous Christian and numerous Jewish authorities. Almost unanimously, the Christian authorities said, yes, you should forgive him.
No.
More unanimously, the Jewish authorities said, absolutely not. And for the reason that Carolyn said, you ask forgiveness from the person you have offended. And if the offense is that you've murdered him, well, then you cannot fulfill that obligation of teshuva, and you will pay the price in the world to come, because you have done what is not forgivable. That is, the person, besides which, to be asked to forgive someone who has offended someone else offends me. I mean, who gives me the proxy right to say I forgive you? It astonishes me whenever we hear, as for example, with the murders in the South Carolina and the Charleston church, the friends and relatives of the people who were murdered say, I forgive the killer. That boggles my mind. That is so beyond my capacity of actually understanding or accepting. But I don't know whether I'm in awe of them or I'm astonished at their lack of self-awareness. I just don't know. It's just, to me, it's beyond my ken.
I believe their religion demands it, and so
yes, it does. And to the extent that the religion demands that which is not humanly possible, we can ask ourselves, is that a good or a bad feature of a religion? But that's way beyond my pay grade to discuss.
It happens a lot, though. It happens in court when a murderer is there, and the murderer who murdered somebody that these people love, they're sitting there, and the murderer says, please forgive me, and they say, yes, I do. Some of them even don't want that person to be in jail or executed because they forgive him. I'm thinking he should rot in hell.
God protect all of us from being in that situation, but I'm pretty sure I know how I would react if I were in that situation.
Is it because when we said that the religion requires it or demands it, is it because in the name of love, like universal love, is that the context in which that somebody, a third party, could assume and take on the authority and give forgiveness like this? Is that because of, in the context of love?
Let me interrupt and say, how much more time do I have? Because I do want
You have 8 minutes, but
8 minutes.
Yeah.
Maybe we'll come back
much
to
time.
that. Maybe we'll come back to that, but I want to cover at least briefly the last couple of things, and one is which is that, you know, you certainly are not obliged under Jewish law to forgive somebody who has not come to you and apologized. And as we said, sometimes you are not obliged to accept an apology either. And then the challenge is, don't I have to accept the apology to be able to go on with my life? And the answer is no. If you can let go of the hurt, if you can put it aside, accepting an apology is not a necessary step in letting go and moving on. It's just something that we could spend more time talking about. But I want to get to the last situation, simply because it's one that fascinates me. It's scenario number 7. And the situation basically is this. There's somebody in your life who's important to you, maybe a mentor, maybe a relative. He or she is a good person. He or she has done good things for you. You appreciate him or her. But there's a missing piece somewhere. There's a bias or a prejudice against a particular group, or an irrational dislike or hatred for a particular person. And you're with this person in a group, and you're doing whatever you're doing. You're schmoozing. It's a social event, and that person tells a joke, one of these, pejorative, nasty racial jokes, or says something very negative and unfair and untrue about a member of the group who this person hates, who doesn't happen to be there at that time. What, if anything, should you do, and when should you do it? And we have a bunch of biblical texts. One is, you should not stand idly by the blood of your neighbor. The other is, reprove your kinsman, but incur no guilt because of him. And that latter phrase, reprove your kinsman, if your kinsman has done something wrong, you are to reprove him, to try to persuade him to make amends and not to do it again. Incur no guilt because of him basically says, it's interpreted as meaning, don't do it publicly because you will embarrass him. You'll be shedding his blood, metaphorically, because his face will get all red or all white when you embarrass him publicly by calling him on the wrong he's done. Do so privately. But what about the situation I've described? You and he are closely associated to other members of the group. You're all together, and this person says something, either makes a racial slur or insults or offends or tells a false story about a member of the group who isn't there. what do you do and when do you do it, and what are the repercussions either way? Because we are all likely to run into this situation or have already. Yes, Natalie?
I guess how I would handle it is I would distance myself from that comment. I would say, you know, this is not how I feel. I would let people know that that's not where I'm coming from. I may be closely associated with this other person, but that's not my feeling. And also, the question, I think, isn't there also an injunction, maybe it's Talmudic, that if you know that you can't change a person's behavior, you shouldn't try, if you know it.
Yeah, I mean, it gets to the point where you know that no effort is going to be fruitful. Yeah. You're not required to bang your head against the wall any longer. What about Natalie's point that you should basically reprove this person in front of everybody else to disassociate yourself from what he said?
I wouldn't say, you know, he shouldn't have said that. I would say that's not how I feel, which is different.
So let me make it harder. He tells a story about this missing person that you know for a fact isn't true. And this story places the missing person in a very negative light. And you know for a fact the story that your mentor, your friend, your relative has said isn't true.
If I know it isn't true,
the story is not
true. I would stand up and say so.
Right.
So, yeah, I think you should stand up against hate speech, because hate speech leads to violence. We know that in this day and age. You know, even if you go back to the Nazis, it all started with you know, saying all these bad things about Jews slowly and poisoning the whole population. So I think it's so important not to let people poison other people's minds, because eventually it leads to violence. That you have to stand up, and yeah, the consequences might be that the friendship will be soured, but you know, it's so important that you should do it.
Other thoughts or comments? So let me ask one last question. A couple of days later, you get together with that friend, and he says, "You really, really hurt me when you said what you said at that meeting. And you offended me terribly." How should you respond?
Well, you really hurt me by your offensive comments.
But is saying that likely to save your relationship to him?
I don't think there is a relationship.
In real life, it could be someone close to you and who just has this negative attitude toward the Z's.
Could be your uncle, it could be your grandfather, it could be having.
Yeah, it could. Yeah, that's a big risk to someone who's been close to you. I don't know.
How about I feel very uncomfortable with your comments about XYZ and the Z's. It really makes me very, very uncomfortable. I think it's unworthy of you.
Again, claiming no expertise and realizing that my time is basically up, I think you're right. Or at least I think that's what I would do. And the interesting thing is the way I would do it is I would violate every rule of apologizing. I would say, "I'm sorry your feeling was hurt, but," because here's a situation where you're not going to apologize for doing the right thing. And I'd explain, I was afraid that people would associate me with your comments, and so I couldn't let that happen. And particularly if you were telling lies about somebody else, I couldn't let that happen, because I'd be standing idly by the blood of my neighbor if I let this false negative story about him get out. Anyway, thank you very much.
And I think sometimes,
shut up already.
I think sometimes, as painful as it is, that we have to take a person like that and say, we can't have that person in our life, no matter what, whether it's a close relative or it was a friend of long standing, that if somebody is so offensive to us and there's no salvaging the relationship because we are diametrically opposed opinions about an issue, that's sometimes, yeah, I wish you well, but I can't have you in my life anymore.
Being past 70 is very liberating. It really is. You can stop worrying about what you might have worried about when you were 45, you know?
On behalf of Hassion, thank you very much for such an inspiring, educational,
Thank you, Professor.
and timely lecture. Now that we can go to Yom Kippur and say something with much enlightenment and a lot more things than I usually attend Yom Kippur services with.
We all be written and sealed for at least a better year than this one.
You're most welcome.
Alavai.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you very much.